succession planning does take time, typically multiple years, right? So 2 to 3 years before you're actually planning to exit and retire is when you should start planning for your succession and the sale of your business. Understanding also the difference between selling and actually exiting your business can be two different things, right? Because even though you sell your company, you'll still have to likely transition out of that business once the business is sold. So really looking at the timeline in a more holistic way, not just specifically around when the sale is, but when someone actually wants to fully exit and retire. Some of the risks, it really does vary, but valuation can be impacted. Perhaps there's fewer buyers that are at the table. If you wait too late, then there could be tax inefficiencies. There's gaps within the leadership team in that transition, so you may have to stay on longer. And overall, I'd say it could just be more stressful if someone leaves the planning and succession too late on. There's a number of different buyers. There's a number of different types of buyers. What's interesting is just how many people view privately held small businesses as a legitimate investment. And that's what's created so much buzz within the buyer universe. So looking at the different types of buyers, you have strategics, individuals, and financial sponsors. Strategic companies are businesses within a private company's sector. So looking at a manufacturing business, they would be someone that's either a competitor or maybe up or down the supply chain from that specific company. Individuals in the market are another group of buyers. They could be high net worth individuals. They could be search fund individuals. So understanding the nuances there is definitely something that's worth noting. And then financial sponsors, more structured private equity groups, family offices. These are parties that are really in the business of deploying capital.
It's actually quite common that we get involved with situations where a business owner has been directly contacted by a buyer. They've never really thought about selling the business before, and they just need to understand what are their options. So the first step, if you've been contacted by a buyer, is take a step back and slow down the process. That buyer is going to want to try to rush you into making a decision. But the reality is this is the most important transaction of your life. You want to make sure that you have the right advisors around you. So is that bringing in an accountant, bringing in the right M&A lawyer, and bringing in an M&A advisor? The next step is really figuring out, based on their interest in your business, what do you think your number is? What is your sale price? Because if you let the buyer set the sale price, the reality is they're incented to set it lower than what you could probably get into the open marketplace. So you want to make sure that you at least have a number before you come into that conversation. So maybe they've thrown out a number already or they haven't. You want to make sure that you have your number. And that means doing a little bit of work and actually getting a business valuation before you take it any step further, because you don't want to leave money on the table. And then once that happens, that buyer may actually be the best buyer for your business, but you ultimately just want to make sure that you're not selling that business for too little, and that you're getting your fair market valuation, and as well that you have the right advisor around the table that can walk along beside you to the closing process.
I think it ties into the overall notion and context of confidentiality. You want to make sure that you're running a sale process in the most confidential manner possible. So a big part of that is, when do you actually stage it to go out to market? How do you stage it to go out to market? Really positioning it as a private sale and making sure that you're only bringing in, the right parties who you actually have vetted and can trust to then share sensitive information with is very important, right? So just overall, I'd say, to answer that question, it's more about maintaining a confidential sale.
So key staff is one of the most important drivers of business valuation. The reason being that a business buyer is going to look at the transition risk of that business. And so the more important you are to your business and the less dependent you can be for that business, then the more likely the valuation is going to be higher. So you want to make sure that the key staff are empowered and are leading your company. And the stronger that team is, the higher the valuation of that business will be. Now, in terms of employee retention, this is a pretty nuanced topic, and it's really important that you work with an advisor to understand when do you bring in key staff into the process, because you don't want to tell them too early in the process to spook them, but at the same time, they're trusted key employees, and any buyer is going to want to sit down with them at a certain time in the process. So it's about really figuring out what works best for your situation. Sometimes that's after an offer is made. Sometimes it's on the 1 yard line the day before closing, and sometimes you don't tell staff until the deal actually closes. So transitioning and figuring out how to retain them is one of the key things that an advisor can help you with.
Succession planning, I'd say, directly impacts valuation in that the better prepared a business owner is, the better outcome they could achieve from their sale. So looking at, how does a buyer view purchasing a privately held business? They're really looking for something that is predictable and something that doesn't have as much perceived risk, right? So they're pricing it based off the predictability of its performance and what are the risk factors within the opportunity. A proper succession plan reduces the amount of risk and will hopefully increase a buyer's confidence in that company's ability to create predictable performance in the future. So, things like strengthening a management team, formalizing processes, all of these things help improve evaluation and lower perceived risk. So really, when thinking about in the context of succession planning, how do you make sure that you're doing something that directly could impact valuation in a positive way? It's important to think about what are the risks and how do you mitigate those. You want to work with a firm that specializes in valuing privately held businesses, really understanding both the internal and external factors that impact value. So, of course, having a pulse on the market, the buyers, what banks are doing, the overall macro factors, and then also a really deep understanding of the key characteristics that drive value. All of these play a key role in determining what a business is worth. So it's important to make sure that you actually speak to a professional who, sells businesses or values businesses as their, day-to-day job, because they're close to the market and they understand what these businesses do trade for. The underlying business will really drive what the ultimate multiple is that a buyer will use, right? So again, looking at kind of the external factors, typically certain industries will trade for higher multiples than others. But even within that, there's always a range of multiples that businesses will trade for within an industry. And whether you're on the lower end or the higher end of that valuation range really is dependent on the internal business and the factors that a buyer is looking at for each specific instance in each specific business, right? Every company is unique. So really, just because an industry is trading at certain multiples, you really need to make sure that you've got a good understanding of, the specific business so that you can zero in on what the business is actually worth.
The biggest piece of advice we can give any business owner that's thinking about selling their business is start the process early. Everything that we have talked about in terms of getting a business ready for sale takes years and years of work. It's not a quick fix. It takes time to get the tax structure right. It's at least 24 months prior to selling a business, to set the company up well so that there's a good middle management team and that the customers are healthy and that the numbers look good. You want to make sure that you start at least 2 to 5 years ahead of time. That's probably the best piece of advice we can give you. When business owners try to sell too quickly or they have to sell in the next 12 months, there's very limited amount of options in terms of trying to ready that business for sale. So starting 2 to 5 years ahead of time is the most important.